Our scripture reading this morning comes from Matthew chapter 14. We're continuing our series on the God we don't believe in. And today we're wrapping up with our very last God we don't believe in, the Heartless God. Our reading begins in Matthew chapter 13.
Whoa, sorry.
So if you weren't paying attention before, you are now. At that time, Herod the ruler heard the news about Jesus. He said to his servants, "This is John the Baptist. He's been raised from the dead. This is why these miraculous powers are at work through him." Herod had arrested John, bound him, and put him in prison because of Herodias, the wife of Herod's brother Philip. That's because John told Herod, "It's against the law for you to marry her." Although Herod wanted to kill him, he feared the crowd because they thought John was a prophet. But at Herod's birthday party, Herodias' daughter danced in front of the guests and thrilled Herod, and then he swore to give her anything she asked. At her mother's urging, the girl said, "Give me the head of John the Baptist here on a plate." Although the king was upset because of his solemn pledge and his guests, he commanded that they give it to her. Then he had John beheaded in prison. They brought his head on a plate and gave it to the young woman, and she brought it to her mother. But John's disciples came and took his body and buried it. Then they went and told Jesus what had happened. When Jesus heard about John, he withdrew in a boat to a deserted place by himself. When the crowds learned this, they followed him on foot from the cities. And when Jesus arrived and saw a large crowd, he had compassion for them, and he healed those who were sick. This is the word of God for the people of God. One of the questions that a lot of the people we encounter every day have, and probably some of us have, is why do such terrible things happen if God is really a loving God? And I think that this is an example of the life in Jesus where something terrible happened to him. Where John the Baptist, who was his cousin, they grew up together, the man that baptized him. They go way back. You might remember from the Christmas story that John and Jesus are in their mother's wombs, and John leapt with joy because he recognized who Jesus was. And so they've had a lot of life together. And then he hears that John has been killed. And his reaction is to go out into the boat, maybe to go fishing, to go be by himself. And then he's encountered by this big crowd who wants to be with him, hearing what has just happened. We see in this story that Jesus isn't a God that just comes to earth to save us like a mechanical salvation machine. It's not just about solving the equation of the cosmos by sticking Jesus in a place where he doesn't deserve to be to throw off everything else, but Jesus is deeply involved in the lives of the people around him while he is still alive, especially John the Baptist. And I could see how, knowing Jesus' special purpose and big mission, the people around him might be hesitant to give him time to mourn or grieve or deal with this terrible thing that's happened. Because I imagine all the things that we say to each other when we need time to mourn or grieve or deal with the terrible things that have happened. Well, Jesus, Herod kills a lot of people. Herod's been killing people mercilessly for your whole life. And the people not killed by the government during this time died of hunger and disease, often, tragically, surprisingly. And there may have been people that thought Jesus just needed to keep on keeping on because John wouldn't want him to be sad. These are some of the things that we say to each other. And there may have been others who loved John, who are angry with Jesus for not being there to stop his death. Because we know that's what happens when Lazarus passes away. Mary and Martha come out and say, well, Jesus, if you had been here, our brother would not have died. And that is when it says that Jesus wept. But we see that Jesus doesn't explain away this terrible thing that's happened. He makes room for himself and for the people around him to experience that pain. He withdraws and takes time to be by himself. And when he sees the crowd, it says that he had compassion. And so today, instead of believing in the God that is distant and mechanical and thrusts terrible things upon us for reasons we don't see, I want to talk about the God who has compassion. Because Jesus has compassion because God is compassionate. We know from the Hebrew scriptures that God is compassionate, slow to anger, and full of steadfast love. That's one of the very first things that Moses says about God, and it's repeated by Jonah and by the psalmists over and over again. God is compassionate, slow to anger, and full of love. And the word compassion literally means to suffer with. That's why we have Passion Plays or Passion Sunday. It's the day that Jesus suffered. It's that story. And compassion is suffering with someone else. And we need to be reminded that every pain we experience, God is with us in it. God doesn't always take it away or make things go the way we really wish they would have gone, or even give us an answer as to why. So sometimes we make up our own answers. And that's how we end up with the God we don't believe in, a God who is not merciful and compassionate and slow to anger and full of steadfast love, but instead a God who is unforgiving, distant, removed from our pain, always angry and fickle. Then we've misunderstood who God really is. And following that God, the fickle, heartless, removed God, the God we don't believe in, following that God is going to lead us to a path of endless pain for the people around us in need of God's grace and compassion. We're going to tear up the hearts and lives of people in real need with our insistence of a God that demands sacrifice and not mercy. And let's not forget that we are those people in need of God's grace and compassion most of all. Secular culture has seen that the imaginary God, who can't handle our pain and can't be the real thing, people have seen through some of the things we've said about God and found it to be insufficient in times of the deepest sadness. That's why we have industries like empathy cards. And so greeting cards are notorious for smoothing over the sad parts of life with floral backgrounds, right? And vague descriptions. But empathy cards are things like Emily McDowell makes, and they say things like, when life gives you lemons, I promise not to tell you about my cousin who died of lemons. Or things like, whoever says everything happens for a reason, let me be the first to pinch them in the arm for you. Or things like, this sucks. and there is absolutely nothing I can do to make it better, except I will be here for you. That message means a lot to people in the deepest pain. And that's a message that God might want to share with them. But instead, we give message that over-spiritualize what's happening. Messages that tell people not to be sad because so-and-so wouldn't want you to. Messages that smooth over things that can't be smoothed over. If you think your only options are empathy from humans or apathy from God, then of course you would pick the comfort of people every single time. But our God is merciful and compassionate, slow to anger, and steadfast in love. And people have no idea what they're missing from the fullness of relationship with God because we've tried to feed them a God that's not real, a God that is insufficient. When Andrew and I were not yet dating, then we were at IHOP on a church trip. And I'd given up meat for Lent, and so I hadn't had bacon in a really long time. But it was my birthday, so we had this whole conversation about, can you have bacon on your birthday if it's during Lent? You know, stuff kids talk about. And then Andrew decided that he would order some bacon, and then I could have it. And then I wasn't ordering bacon during Lent, I was just not wasting bacon during Lent. Because it turns out Andrew doesn't like bacon anyway. He always gets sausage when he goes to breakfast. And so our whole relationship, we thought that Andrew didn't really like bacon that much. And then, years and years later, then Andrew and I got married. And it was probably all to do with that very first time at IHOP when he gave me my bacon. Probably. And we stay the night at this bed and breakfast, and the next day we have breakfast, and they come and take our little order, and Andrew says, well, do you have breakfast sausage? And they said, no, we only have bacon. And Andrew said, well, that's fine. Maybe bacon's all right. And so he gets some bacon, and he takes a bite of it, and he says, this is really good. He says, my whole life I thought I didn't like bacon. And we come to find out that at the Trigg household, they had been eating turkey bacon his whole life. And he got scammed into marrying me over turkey bacon. Well, that's a different conversation. And there are people in our lives who have never tasted the God of real bacon, because we've been giving them turkey bacon God and telling them it's the same thing. We've been feeding it to them their whole lives, and they've decided it's not really for them. But the real thing is still waiting to be discovered. The God we do believe in is desperate to reach out to them, to bring the love and clarity and healing that only a big, wonderful, compassionate God can bring. And so as I think about all of these gods that we don't believe in, the God that doesn't care about the things that we go through, the God that makes bad things happen to us, the God that answers our prayers without really concerned about what's going on intimately in our lives, but just like answering divine email. But the real God is what I really would love to share. I'm not interested in giving out turkey bacon God to people anymore. And so I hope all together we can make a commitment to say no to accepting the easy answers for the big questions of faith that keep us up at night. And we're afraid that if we share them, then other people will reject the God we've shared. To never try to control someone's behavior without touching their heart. To remind each other constantly of the intensely close, overwhelming love of the real thing. The real, honest-to-goodness, full-fat, deep-fried God. And the true, wonderful compassion of the God that we really do believe in.